the first thing they noticed was the quiet. Not the quiet of the battlefield, not the silence that followed artillery and screams, but the sterile, controlled quiet of the field hospital. Bodies groaned, bandages rustled, but no one shouted. No one cursed. The Axis soldiers, crumpled against stretchers, battered and bleeding, had been prepared for screams, chaos, punishment. Instead, they found order. They were laid on cots, their uniforms stained with mud, blood, and the grime of battle. Their limbs ached. Their faces were pale, hollow, eyes wide with disbelief. They had been told to expect the worst: filthy conditions, minimal care, perhaps outright neglect. But a medic, calm and precise, approached each soldier, examining wounds with gloved hands, not in haste, but with care. One soldier from Italy, arm shattered in a firefight, flinched as a scalpel hovered above his wound. He braced for pain, for a scream to pierce the air, for the fury of an enemy he had been taught to hate. Instead, the scalpel worked efficiently. The pain was present, yes, but measured, controlled. The blood was cleaned, the dressing applied with meticulous attention. The man blinked in confusion. Could this be real? Could they be treating us, not as enemies, but as human beings? Another soldier, a German with a deep gash across his torso, was given morphine. He hesitated, suspicious. Pain relief from the enemy? Surely this was a trick, some psychological ploy. Yet, as the drug coursed through his veins, he felt a calm he had not known in months. He closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of relief, though guilt gnawed at the back of his mind. To accept care from the Americans felt like betrayal, not of his country, but of the very identity he had clung to for survival. The organization stunned them. Stretchers lined the hall with precision, supplies stacked in neat rows, instruments sterilized and ready. They had seen hospitals before, but never like this. Here, the wounded received attention swiftly, without discrimination. Every man was treated, regardless of rank, nationality, or past deeds. The notion that the enemy could display such professionalism, such mercy, was incomprehensible. They whispered to each other, incredulous. "This is impossible," one muttered. "They must be pretending. They cannot truly care for us like this." Another whispered back, "Perhaps it is a trap. They are experimenting, observing how we respond to kindness." Rumors spread quickly, fueled by fear and disbelief. One claimed that American medics had invented surgical techniques years before the war but had hidden them from their own troops, an absurd idea, but one that gave the POWs a way to rationalize what they saw. And yet, despite their doubts, the soldiers were treated. Wounds were cleaned, bones splinted, bandages applied. Some received penicillin, a drug many had never seen used in the field. Others were stabilized for evacuation, their survival no longer a question of chance but of skillful care. The level of medical attention was so advanced that the men could hardly comprehend it. In the corner, nurses, faces calm, hands steady, moved with a rhythm that was almost ritualistic. They spoke softly to the men, offering comfort, explaining procedures. It was not enough to heal the body alone, they seemed intent on healing the mind, as though care and compassion were as important as sutures and splints. Some soldiers could not accept it. Pride, indoctrination, and fear clashed inside them. They were trained to endure pain, to view weakness as shameful, to resist the enemy even at the cost of their own survival. To lie on a cot and allow their wounds to be tended by the Americans was to surrender, not just their bodies, but their long-held beliefs. Yet, slowly, they yielded. Pain was reduced, wounds stabilized, and the unimaginable occurred: a seed of gratitude sprouted in their hearts. They had been taught to hate, to distrust, to expect only cruelty. And yet, here it was, undeniable and simple: care. The paradox was almost unbearable. How could the enemy, the very people they had been taught to despise, show such skill, such attention, such mercy? Their minds raced. Perhaps this was what the Americans wanted, to break them not with weapons, but with kindness. Perhaps their survival depended on adapting to this unexpected reality. In that moment, as they lay on their cots, bandages freshly applied, morphine taking the edge off their pain, one thought settled over them like a shadow: if you survive, will you remember who saved you, or will your pride let you deny the truth? And here, dear listener, is where you must ask yourself, would you have allowed your enemy to heal you? Would you have accepted their hands, their tools, their medicine, even as every instinct screamed betrayal? Or would you have let yourself suffer, clinging to hate rather than life? For these soldiers, every drop of blood cleaned, every bandage applied, was not just survival, it was a moral battlefield. And the truth was as simple as it was cruel: those who refused to accept care risked more than their bodies, they risked losing their humanity entirely. The air inside the field hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic, mingled with the coppery scent of blood. The Axis soldiers, still sprawled on stretchers, stared at the medics with disbelief. Some had been carried in from the front lines for hours, their wounds raw, their bodies trembling from shock and exhaustion. They had prepared for cruelty, for neglect, even for the possibility that the enemy would let them bleed out. But now, as the Americans approached with bandages, splints, and surgical tools, that expectation was shattered. The first triage began. Medics moved methodically, checking pulses, examining wounds, and talking softly to the prisoners in a language many understood just enough to follow. The soldiers flinched as hands probed injuries, expecting sudden pain or rough treatment. Instead, they felt gentleness, efficiency, and care. One German soldier, his leg mangled in a recent firefight, stiffened as a medic bent over him. The man braced for pain, expecting the scalpel to be wielded carelessly. But the wound was cleaned meticulously, disinfectant applied without a harsh touch. Every movement was precise. The soldier's eyes widened. He had survived bullets, shrapnel, frostbite, and disease, and yet here he was being treated as if his life mattered, by the very enemy he had been trained to hate. Another POW, a young Italian, received morphine for a chest wound. He hesitated, refusing the syringe at first. "Why would they give me this?" he whispered. "Is it a trick?" The medic smiled faintly, explaining in broken Italian that it was to ease the pain, nothing more. Reluctantly, the POW allowed it, and within moments, the tension in his body softened. For the first time in days, he felt calm. The sensation was alien. Relief had always been a fleeting memory. Now it was real. The American medics worked quickly, but methodically. Bloodied uniforms were removed, wounds cleaned, and dressings applied with care. Men received basic sutures, limbs were splinted, and the air was filled with the low hum of activity rather than the shouts and curses they had expected. They had imagined hospitals as chaotic, dangerous, places where POWs might be ignored or even punished. Instead, they witnessed precision, professionalism, and, most impossible of all, humanity. Rumors began to circulate among the POWs, whispered from cot to cot. Some claimed the medics were using techniques developed in secret laboratories, far more advanced than what their own armies possessed. Others swore that the morphine and penicillin had magical properties, capable of healing even the gravest injuries overnight. "The Americans must have stolen our best scientists," one soldier joked, though there was no truth to it. The misinformation, born of disbelief, spread quickly. The treatments went beyond basic survival. Medics checked vitals repeatedly, monitored for infection, and ensured the wounded were stabilized. Even in the chaos of war, there was an order and a calmness that the prisoners could not understand. The efficiency was almost too perfect, too deliberate. It felt like a test. Some soldiers could not accept it. Pride and indoctrination clashed with the reality of care. How could the enemy, so monstrous in propaganda, treat them with such respect? How could they wash the dirt from their bodies, administer pain relief, and stabilize injuries without expectation of payment or retribution? A few POWs refused treatment, believing it was a trap, that every stitch and every dose was a way to weaken them mentally. Yet, no matter their hesitation, the care persisted. A German corporal with a chest wound that had begun to fester was cleaned, treated with antibiotics, and wrapped. He watched, unsure whether to feel grateful or suspicious. By the end of the day, the fear of the enemy's cruelty had begun to dissolve. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was something more unsettling. They were learning to rely on the mercy of those they had been taught to hate. The medics moved from soldier to soldier, sometimes pausing to offer a word of reassurance. The simple acts, a bandage folded neatly, a pillow adjusted, a hand gently pressed to soothe pain, were revolutionary to the prisoners. They had been conditioned to endure, to fight through suffering, to distrust all kindness. And yet, here it was, undeniable and unavoidable. And in the silence between treatments, the question gnawed at their minds: if this is what the enemy gives willingly, without coercion, without reward, then what does it mean about everything we have been taught? Here, dear viewer, pause and reflect. Would you have accepted care from an enemy? Would you have let your pride, your fear, your indoctrination prevent you from surviving? Every bandage, every dose of medicine, was more than treatment, it was a challenge to their beliefs, their identity, their survival instinct. For the Axis soldiers lying on cots, the battlefield had extended beyond bullets and bombs. It now existed in the quiet precision of a medic's hands, in the soft murmur of instructions, and in the hum of sterile equipment. Each act of care was a quiet revolution, a shift in what they believed about humanity, mercy, and the enemy. The sounds of the field hospital were a strange symphony, the hiss of sterilizers, the low murmur of medics, the quiet groans of men whose injuries were grave but not fatal. Axis soldiers, still reeling from the chaos of battle, could hardly comprehend what they were seeing. Here, in the heart of enemy territory, medicine was being performed at a level that seemed impossible. One of the first wonders came in the form of blood transfusions. A young German private watched as a medic carefully inserted a needle, watching the crimson flow into another man's veins. The transfusion was smooth, efficient, painless. The private's eyes widened. "Is this even real?" he whispered, his voice trembling. In the armies he had served, men bled out for lack of supplies or knowledge. Here, the blood moved from one human to another seamlessly, saving life in real time. The astonishment continued with antibiotics and penicillin. Soldiers who had suffered gangrene, infected wounds, or feverish limbs found that medicine could heal what they had thought untreatable. They had been trained to endure infections, to wait for death or long-term disability. Now, with a few doses administered carefully by the medics, limbs were saved, pain was reduced, and infections that should have been fatal were treated as routine. Morphine, too, became a source of both relief and disbelief. Men who had endured excruciating pain without aid now felt the sudden calm sweep over their bodies. One Italian corporal, his jaw broken in combat, had been on the verge of collapse. He accepted morphine reluctantly, expecting some trick, some cruel side effect. But the relief was immediate, and the shock on his face was evident. He had survived war with nothing but grit, now a simple syringe restored him. Some soldiers could not believe it. Their indoctrination screamed that mercy could not exist from the enemy. That aid must have strings, a trap, a lesson. "Perhaps they are using these treatments to manipulate us," whispered a Japanese soldier, his arm bandaged and trembling. Rumors spread across the wards, whispers of secret experimental drugs, of miraculous surgeries performed in hidden laboratories. One man insisted that Americans had invented penicillin during the war itself, ignoring its actual discovery in 1928. The absurdity didn't matter, it made sense to them in the chaos of disbelief. And yet, no trick or rumor could erase the undeniable fact: the treatments worked. Broken bones were set with precision, bullets were extracted, wounds cleaned and dressed without hesitation. The medics worked tirelessly, their movements calm and deliberate, even under the pressure of continuous casualties. Every patient was treated with dignity, every life valued. The POW's reactions varied. Some stared in awe, unable to reconcile the scene before them with the propaganda they had absorbed. They had been taught that Americans were reckless, cruel, even barbaric. And yet, here were men, risking their lives in the chaos of war, showing compassion, skill, and care. Others struggled with guilt. Accepting aid from the enemy felt like betrayal, not just of their nation, but of themselves. Could they allow these hands to save them? Could they survive under the mercy of those they had been trained to hate? Some refused the most advanced treatments, bandaging their own wounds as best they could, clinging to the idea that suffering was a virtue. But even in refusing, they could not deny the evidence. Their comrades were being saved, revived, and restored to strength. And then there were those who embraced the care, trembling hands accepting syringes, bandages, and medicines. For them, survival was paramount. They set aside pride, ideology, and fear, recognizing that life was a gift, even when offered by the enemy. Every drop of medicine was a quiet revolution, a shift in what it meant to survive. Among the whispers and rumors, one question haunted them: why would the enemy save us so carefully? Was it an act of true mercy, or some calculated method to break their will? Could kindness be weaponized? Could a syringe of morphine or a carefully sewn suture strip away not just pain, but loyalty? Here, dear listener, stop for a moment and ask yourself, if your life hung in the balance, could you accept care from those you were trained to hate? Could you survive, even if it meant bowing to mercy you didn't trust? Every injection, every bandage, every stitch was not just treatment, it was a challenge to the very beliefs they carried into captivity. By the end of the day, the soldiers were exhausted, not just from pain or injury, but from the emotional toll. They had seen humanity where they expected cruelty. They had received aid from those they had been taught to despise. And though they might never fully accept it, a seed had been planted, a seed that would grow, slowly, over the weeks and months, into a new understanding of survival, trust, and the paradox of compassion. The wounded lay on cots, their bodies tended to, their pain eased, yet their minds refused to settle. The battlefield had taught them to distrust, to fear, to hate. And now, here, in the heart of the enemy's camp, care was being offered freely. It was incomprehensible. Some soldiers stared at the medics, their hands trembling. One German private, whose leg had been nearly shattered by artillery, could not reconcile the calm efficiency with the propaganda he had absorbed since childhood. "They cannot truly care for us," he muttered under his breath. Yet every stitch, every bandage, every drop of morphine told him otherwise. The Japanese soldiers were no less conflicted. Many of them had endured months of malnutrition, disease, and neglect. They had been trained to see Americans as reckless, cruel, even sadistic. And now, here they were, receiving the very best treatment imaginable. The warm hands, the careful attention, the professionalism, it was more than their minds could process. Some POWs began to feel guilt. They had fought for an ideology that demanded obedience and hatred toward the enemy. And yet, as their wounds were cleaned, their bones splinted, and their pain alleviated, a strange sense of gratitude emerged. Could they allow themselves to feel it? Could they survive while acknowledging that the hands saving them belonged to those they had been taught to despise? Other soldiers struggled differently. Pride clashed with relief. The older veterans, men hardened by years of battle, resisted the care, not because it was harmful but because it violated every principle they had internalized. To accept morphine, to allow someone else to tend to their wounds, felt like a surrender. They had endured death and injury with stoicism, and now, in the face of mercy, they were confronted with a weakness they did not know they possessed. Rumors whispered through the wards. Some claimed that American nurses were secretly spies, using each treatment to gather intelligence on the POW's morale. Others insisted that the equipment and medicines were experimental, designed to manipulate the mind as much as the body. One veteran even swore that the morphine was laced with hallucinogens, a fanciful mistake born of fear and mistrust. Yet, despite these suspicions, the aid continued, unwavering and methodical. For a few, the care sparked a transformation. The fear, fatigue, and suspicion began to yield to a tentative recognition. The enemy could act with compassion. One Italian corporal, who had spent weeks in a feverish haze, finally allowed himself to relax under the ministrations of a nurse. He felt his pulse stabilize, his breathing calm. For the first time since capture, he allowed himself to hope. Others could not allow hope to flourish. They recoiled from the human touch of the medics, questioning the motives behind every act of kindness. Pride, indoctrination, and fear created a psychological wall. They could not yet trust that relief from pain did not carry hidden consequences. Yet even the most skeptical could not ignore the facts. Wounds healed. Lives were saved. Limbs once thought doomed regained function. The very act of receiving care was a contradiction. An enemy, armed with weapons that had taken their comrades, now offered the one thing they most needed: survival. And in that contradiction, the prisoners were forced to confront themselves. Could they survive without betrayal, not of their country, but of their own understanding of honor and loyalty? Could they allow the hands of those they had been taught to hate to shape their recovery, their chance to live another day? Dear listener, pause and ask yourself, if the enemy extended mercy when you expected cruelty, could you accept it? Could you survive without clinging to the hatred that has been instilled in you since birth? Every bandage, every syringe, every careful procedure demanded not just physical surrender but moral reckoning. Some men allowed themselves to weep quietly, the weight of disbelief and gratitude pressing down on them. Others clenched their fists, unable to reconcile the compassion with the ideology they had carried into captivity. And yet, regardless of their response, each soldier was changed. The battlefield had always been a place of injury and fear, but now it had become a place of reflection, where survival was intertwined with trust, hope, and the unthinkable kindness of the enemy. Even as they processed the experience, one thought lingered in their minds, sharp and insistent: could the enemy's mercy truly exist in a world built on war? Or would it be taken away, as if kindness itself were a weapon too dangerous to allow? The question remained unanswered, yet it haunted them as much as any bullet wound or scar. And in that haunting, a subtle transformation began. The care they received did not erase the pain or the losses of war, but it introduced an unfamiliar feeling, a possibility that survival could be more than mere endurance. It could be guided by compassion, even from those they had been trained to despise. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the field hospital became strangely familiar. The Axis soldiers, once overwhelmed by pain and disbelief, began to settle into a new reality, one where care existed not as a weapon, but as a lifeline. Wounds that had festered in the chaos of war began to heal. Limbs once thought doomed regained function. Even the soldiers who had resisted at first could not deny the evidence of their own recovery. Some men looked down at their bandaged hands and marveled at the precision. Stitches were perfectly aligned. No unnecessary pain was inflicted. The medications worked, fever reduced, infection halted. They had survived battles where nothing could save them, yet now a simple regimen of care and medicine was performing miracles. One German soldier, who had been certain he would lose his leg, now moved with a cautious pride. He flexed his toes, felt the tendons reconnect with strength, and let a small smile cross his face. It was a private triumph, one that he had not expected to feel in captivity. The battlefields of Europe had taught him survival was about endurance and cunning. Here, survival required acceptance, acceptance of care, acceptance of the enemy's mercy. The Japanese POWs were equally astonished. They had endured starvation, frostbite, and disease, yet the treatments restored not just their bodies, but a sense of possibility. They felt energy returning to their limbs, clarity to their minds, and even a sense of control over the chaos that had dominated their lives. For months, perhaps years, they had been powerless. Now they felt agency in accepting care. And yet, the psychological struggle persisted. To accept aid from the enemy was to acknowledge a truth they had been trained to deny, that not all Americans were cruel, that the enemy could act with skill, precision, and humanity. Pride warred with gratitude. Ideology clashed with survival. Some POWs refused certain treatments, insisting they would endure pain rather than accept what they considered an unnatural gift. They resisted injections, bandages, and even simple dressings, convinced the care was a subtle attempt to weaken their resolve. Rumors spread that the medications contained experimental compounds or that the surgeons were secretly testing psychological responses, a fantastical exaggeration born from fear and indoctrination. But resistance had consequences. Those who clung to pride found their recovery slower, their pain prolonged. Every wound left untreated, every dose refused, reminded them that survival often demanded humility, even in the hands of the enemy. The longer the soldiers stayed, the more obvious it became: care was consistent, effective, and impartial. American medics did not discriminate between nations, ranks, or histories. Each life was treated with the same attention to detail. The POWs began to observe the logic behind the order. This was not trickery, not deceit, not propaganda. It was medicine. It was humanity. One Italian soldier, who had watched comrades survive only through chance and ingenuity, finally allowed himself to be examined fully. The relief was immediate. Muscles regained strength, pain subsided, and fatigue lifted. He realized that survival required more than endurance. It required openness, trust, and sometimes, humility. As days passed, conversations among the POWs shifted. Where there had been whispers of suspicion, there were now murmurs of acknowledgement. Soldiers began to speak of gratitude in hushed tones, sharing stories of recovery, of miraculous interventions, of lives saved when they expected only death. It was a strange camaraderie, forged not in battle, but in the quiet recognition that they had been spared by hands they had been trained to fear. Even the resistors began to change. Not immediately, not entirely, but slowly. They saw the evidence: wounds healing, energy returning, survival rates higher than expected. Pride remained, yes, but it was tempered by reality. The enemy's care had succeeded where brute force and cunning had once failed. And then there were the mistakes that whispered through the ranks, absurd but persistent. Some POWs claimed that American medics had invented machines that could perform surgeries underwater, or that antibiotics were secretly designed in laboratories hidden in the Rockies. Of course, none of this was true, but it reflected their struggle to reconcile reality with disbelief. They needed explanations, however impossible, to make sense of the care they received. Through all this, a subtle transformation occurred. Survival was no longer merely endurance. It had become acceptance. Acceptance of care. Acceptance of mercy. Acceptance that the enemy could, in some instances, act with decency. The men began to reflect on what that meant for themselves, their beliefs, and their understanding of the world. Dear viewer, stop for a moment and ask yourself this: if your survival depended on the mercy of those you had been taught to hate, would you accept it, or cling to pride until it cost you your life? Every bandage applied, every injection administered, was more than a medical act. It was a moral reckoning. By the end of their time in the hospital, many of the POWs had emerged fundamentally changed. Their bodies healed, yes, but their minds had shifted as well. They had learned that survival did not require abandoning one's humanity. They had learned that mercy could exist in the most unlikely of places. And they had learned that life itself, fragile and fleeting, was worth accepting, even when it came from the hands of the enemy. The wounded lay quietly on cots, the hum of the field hospital around them. For weeks, the Axis soldiers had observed a rhythm in the care they received, a rhythm of order, attention, and surprising compassion. Slowly, the tension that had gripped their minds began to ease, replaced by a cautious curiosity about the people who treated them so relentlessly and yet with gentleness. It began in small gestures. A medic adjusting a blanket over a shivering prisoner. A nurse whispering instructions softly in German, calming a young soldier terrified of the pain he had endured. Even the smallest acts, the careful folding of a bandage, the steadying of a hand as an injection was administered, became profound symbols of care. Some POWs, initially distrustful, began to watch these actions closely. They noted the meticulous care, the precision, and the lack of impatience. The Americans were not watching them for amusement or to assert dominance, they were watching them to save lives. Rumors still circulated, of course. Some soldiers insisted that the medics were spies, documenting every word, every gesture, for intelligence purposes. Others claimed that the equipment was experimental, capable of performing surgical miracles beyond known science. One man even suggested the nurses had been trained in secret schools run by European intelligence agencies, an absurd claim, but one that made sense to those struggling to reconcile their indoctrination with the reality before them. And yet, the bonds continued to form. When one German soldier winced in pain as a wound was cleaned, a medic's hand remained steady on his shoulder, grounding him. When a Japanese POW whispered a question about a procedure, a nurse explained patiently, repeating herself until the man nodded in understanding. The POWs began to realize that the people caring for them were not just skilled, they were invested in their survival. The soldiers who had once resisted care began to notice changes in themselves. The fear and hatred that had filled their hearts softened as they observed repeated acts of competence and humanity. They could not deny the difference between the chaos of battlefields and the calm of these halls. Even the most stubborn began to accept care they had once refused, if only reluctantly. Physical healing progressed alongside emotional transformation. Men began to converse quietly with one another about the care they had received, comparing notes on morphine doses, sutures, and medications. They whispered, shared small smiles, and even laughed softly at the absurdity of their disbelief. The realization that the enemy had treated them humanely was sinking in. Some began to see patterns in the actions of the medics. There was no favoritism, no cruelty, no hidden motive beyond preservation. They noted the efficiency, the patience, and the attention to detail. Slowly, respect grew, not the respect born of fear, but the respect born of witnessing skill paired with compassion. It was not without tension. Pride and ideology still resisted. Some soldiers would take care reluctantly, eyes narrowed, bodies stiff, wary of every gesture. Yet even they could not deny the tangible results: wounds healed, energy returned, and life, fragile and resilient, persisted. One particularly severe injury, a German soldier with a shattered arm, served as a turning point. He had initially refused treatment, convinced that the medics were manipulating him. Days passed, and infection began to set in. Finally, grudgingly, he allowed the procedure. When the bandages were removed a week later, he could move his fingers again. The relief was overwhelming. For the first time, he recognized that acceptance did not diminish strength, it preserved it. Across the wards, the POWs began forming a quiet fraternity, not of friendship with the Americans, but of understanding with each other. They shared knowledge about treatment, whispered warnings, and offered comfort. Bonds were forged in the act of survival, in the shared acknowledgement that care, when genuine, transcended nationality and ideology. And yet, disbelief lingered. How could the enemy show such patience and skill? How could they provide life-saving care without expecting something in return? Some whispered again that it must be a trick, an experiment to study their responses. Others shook their heads in disbelief, realizing that perhaps they had been wrong all along. The dichotomy of hatred and gratitude twisted inside them, impossible to untangle completely. Dear viewer, consider this: if someone you were trained to fear and hate offered you a lifeline, could you trust them, or would pride and ideology blind you to survival? Every act of care was a quiet test, asking whether they would endure pain for the sake of principle, or accept mercy for the sake of life. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in the hospital had shifted. POWs who had once fought against care now found themselves seeking it, relying on the expertise of the medics, and even sharing a word of gratitude in quiet moments. They had come to understand something profoundly uncomfortable: survival sometimes required acknowledging humanity in those you had been taught to despise. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Wounds healed. Limbs regained function. Pain subsided. But more than that, attitudes shifted. Skepticism softened. Hatred became less absolute. Even the most hardened soldiers began to see the paradox of war, that the enemy could destroy lives and yet preserve them with the same hands. Years later, the POWs would speak of the war in terms of survival and brutality, but the memory that lingered most vividly was the care they had received. The hospitals, the medics, the endless attention to wounds and suffering, these were not just memories of healing, they were lessons in humanity. The soldiers who had once doubted every act of kindness now reflected on their disbelief with a mix of awe and shame. They had been trained to hate, taught that the enemy was cruel, deceptive, and untrustworthy. And yet, when their lives hung in the balance, it was the enemy's hands that had saved them. They could not forget it, even when they returned to the chaos and deprivation of a Europe still recovering from war. Some veterans carried the lessons of care in practical ways. They washed more carefully, tended to injuries with precision, and observed hygiene with newfound respect. They had been taught that endurance defined strength, but they now understood that survival sometimes required humility and acceptance. To ignore care, to reject help, could have cost them their lives. The younger soldiers, those who had been teenagers when captured, reflected on the paradox daily. They had witnessed enemies who could destroy and enemies who could restore. They had learned, often reluctantly, that the line between cruelty and compassion could exist in the same person. One POW recalled a medic who treated both German and American soldiers indiscriminately, a stark reminder that impartial care could be offered even amid war. Rumors, myths, and small mistakes persisted in the memories of the men. Some swore the American medics had invented surgical robots before the war. Others claimed blood transfusions were powered by hidden generators that defied science. These exaggerations, though false, reflected the POW's struggle to reconcile reality with their past indoctrination. They had been trained to expect cruelty, and extraordinary care felt almost supernatural. Yet despite the absurdities, the truth was undeniable: they had lived because of this care. Limbs had been saved, wounds healed, lives restored. Men who had expected death now carried the weight of survival into the post-war world. And with survival came reflection, a confrontation with their own beliefs, their pride, and the humanity of those they had once hated. Some POWs would later describe feeling a quiet shame. Had they let ideology blind them to mercy? Had they refused care when it could have saved them? They understood now that survival was not just about grit or endurance. It was about acknowledging life where it was offered, even by those trained to be enemies. The hospitals themselves faded into memory, but the lessons endured. Stories of advanced field medicine, pain management, sterile procedures, antibiotics, were retold not just as facts, but as symbols of the unexpected power of compassion. Veterans recounted to their families how the enemy's skill and mercy had spared them, how the care they had once resisted had become a defining moment of their lives. For some, the moral struggle persisted long after the physical wounds healed. How could one reconcile gratitude with the training to hate? How could one respect the hands that had saved them without betraying loyalty to their own cause? These questions haunted many, a reminder that the battlefield extended beyond bullets and bombs. It existed in the choices of the living, in the acceptance of mercy, and in the confrontation with one's own humanity. Even decades later, the soldiers remembered the details vividly: the glint of scalpel under fluorescent lights, the careful folding of bandages, the quiet reassurance of medics who treated them like men rather than enemies. They remembered how survival had demanded humility and trust, and how those acts of care had reshaped their understanding of what it meant to live. And here, dear viewer, consider this: if your survival depended on the mercy of someone you had been trained to hate, could you accept it, or would pride blind you to life itself? Every needle, every bandage, every act of skillful care was more than a medical intervention. It was a moral challenge, one the POWs faced daily. The legacy of battlefield medicine went beyond healing wounds. It left an indelible mark on the men who had once been taught to see only enemies. They carried the lesson that mercy could exist in war, that skill could coexist with compassion, and that survival often required setting aside pride and ideology. Some shared these lessons openly, teaching their children about the unexpected humanity of foes. Others carried the memories quietly, a private acknowledgement of the paradox they had survived. But all of them were changed. Survival had come with a price, not in body, but in conscience, the realization that life, even from the hands of the enemy, was a gift not to be squandered. The hospitals, the medics, the seemingly impossible care, all became symbols of a hard truth: humanity can exist in the most unlikely places. And for the POWs, that realization was as transformative as any battlefield victory, as profound as any lesson learned in the chaos of war.